Dr. Sarah Chen looked nothing like the other researchers boarding the transport ship to Kepler 442b. While her colleagues were tall, muscular specimens from high-gravity worlds, Sarah stood barely 5 feet tall with thin arms and pale skin that spoke of a life spent in laboratories, rather than training facilities. The medical scanner at the spaceport had beeped disapprovingly when she passed through, flagging her bone density as critically low and her muscle mass as insufficient for hostile environment deployment. The Galactic Research Council had been reluctant to approve her transfer to the Kepler expedition. The planet was classified as a Class 9 Deathworld, where even the plants could kill an unprepared visitor within minutes. Most humans assigned there came from Mars colonies or the heavy gravity mining stations of Europa. Their bodies adapted to harsh conditions through generations of selective pressure. But Sarah had something her colleagues lacked, an unprecedented understanding of xenobiology that had revolutionized how humans approached alien ecosystems. Her doctoral thesis on symbiotic relationships between Earth predators and their environments had become required reading at every major university in the solar system. When 3 previous xenobiologists had failed to establish meaningful contact with Kepler 442b's ecosystem, the Council had finally approved her request despite her obvious physical limitations. The journey to Kepler took 18 months in cryosleep. Sarah woke to find herself in the ship's medical bay, surrounded by concerned faces. Her body had not handled the extended hibernation well. Her already thin frame had lost additional muscle mass, and her bones showed signs of further deterioration despite the calcium supplements administered during sleep. Commander Rodriguez, a barrel-chested man from the Titan colonies, shook his head as he reviewed her medical readouts. "Doc, I'm going to be honest with you. The safety protocols require me to recommend you stay on the orbital station. What you're showing here," he gestured at the holographic display showing her vital statistics. "These numbers would get you rejected for a simple Earth nature hike, let alone a Deathworld expedition." Sarah had heard similar concerns her entire career. She was used to being underestimated, used to having doors closed in her face because her body didn't match what people expected from an explorer. But she had not traveled 18 months across space to sit in an orbital station, while others did the work she was uniquely qualified for. "Commander, with respect, those protocols were written by people who think strength is measured only in muscle mass and bone density. I've survived in environments that would challenge your strongest colonists not through brute force but through understanding." She pulled up her own research files on the portable display. "While others were trying to dominate hostile ecosystems, I was learning to become part of them." The expedition members gathered around as Sarah showed footage from her work on Proxima Centauri b. The planet's surface was dominated by crystalline formations that generated lethal electromagnetic pulses every few hours. Previous teams had tried to shield themselves with heavy equipment and failed. Sarah had studied the native organisms and discovered they synchronized their life cycles with the pulses, using the energy rather than fighting it. By mimicking their behavior patterns, she had spent 3 months on the surface, mapping an entire ecosystem that others had declared impossible to study. Rodriguez remained skeptical. "Proxima b is different from what we're facing here. Kepler 442b isn't just hostile, it's actively predatory. The preliminary reports show organisms that specifically target and eliminate foreign biological signatures. You're not just fighting the environment, you're fighting creatures that view you as food." Sarah smiled, an expression that carried more confidence than her frail appearance suggested. "Commander, do you know what the most successful predators on Earth have in common? It's not size or strength. It's the ability to form unexpected partnerships. The most dangerous hunters on my homeworld don't hunt alone. They integrate into systems that make them more effective than they could ever be individually." She showed them recordings from her graduate research in the Amazon rainforest. Other researchers had used boats and helicopters to maintain distance from the dangerous wildlife. Sarah had walked alone into territories where jaguars hunted and anacondas waded in the water. But she hadn't gone in as an intruder. She had studied the forest communication networks, learned to read the subtle signals that animals use to announce their presence and intentions. Within weeks, she was moving through some of Earth's most dangerous ecosystems with a freedom that amazed her supervising professors. "The secret isn't being stronger than the predators," she explained to the gathered team. "The secret is convincing them you're not prey. And sometimes, if you're very good at what you do, you can convince them you're something much more valuable than food." The expedition's other xenobiologist, Dr. Marcus Webb from the Europa deep mining colonies laughed dismissively. His cybernetic enhancements glinted under the ship's lights as he crossed his arms. That's a nice theory, Chen, but you're talking about Earth animals with Earth psychology. The preliminary reports from Kepler show organisms that operate on completely different principles. They don't just kill for food or territory, they eliminate anything that doesn't belong to their ecosystem's design. Sarah had read those reports. 3 previous expeditions had established surface bases, only to have them systematically dismantled by creatures that seemed to appear from nowhere. The attacks weren't random or driven by hunger. They were precise, coordinated efforts to remove foreign elements from the environment. Equipment would be dissolved by acidic secretions. Structures would be undermined by burrowing organisms. Personnel would simply disappear during routine operations, leaving behind only traces of exotic biochemical markers. That's exactly why the standard approach won't work, Sarah replied. You're thinking like invaders planning to establish a foothold by force. But what if the ecosystem isn't trying to eliminate us because we're threats? What if it's trying to eliminate us because we don't understand how to belong? The ship's sensors chimed as they entered Kepler 442b's orbital space. Through the viewports, the planet appeared as a swirling mass of green and blue, with cloud formations that moved in patterns too regular to be natural. Even from orbit, it was clear they were approaching something unprecedented in human experience. Sarah pressed her hand against the cold metal of the viewport and felt a familiar excitement building in her chest. She had built her career on moments like this, standing at the threshold of systems that others declared impossible to understand. Her body might be weak, her bones brittle, her muscles insufficient for the challenges ahead, but she carried something that no amount of physical conditioning could provide: the patience to listen to what the universe was trying to tell her, and the wisdom to respond in ways that turned enemies into allies. As the transport ship began its descent toward the planet's surface, Sarah Chen prepared to discover whether her lifetime of learning to speak the language of hostile worlds would be enough to survive humanity's encounter with its most dangerous challenge yet. The landing site chosen by the orbital reconnaissance team sat in what appeared to be a clearing surrounded by towering structures that might have been trees, if trees could be made of living metal and crystal. The moment the transport touched down, Sarah could feel something was different about this world. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made her instruments dance with readings she had never seen before. Commander Rodriguez established the perimeter with military precision, his enhanced soldiers deploying defensive barriers and sensor arrays in a perfect defensive formation. Within an hour, they had created a fortified camp that could theoretically withstand anything the planet might throw at them. Sarah watched the construction with growing unease. Every barrier they erected, every sensor they activated, seemed to generate subtle responses from the surrounding environment. Plants would shift position slightly. The ground itself would develop new textures overnight. Dr. Webb immediately began collecting samples, his cybernetic arms allowing him to handle specimens that would be deadly to unprotected humans. His approach was methodical and aggressive, cutting through anything that looked interesting and storing it in containment units for later analysis. Sarah noticed that every sample he took seemed to generate small disturbances in the wider ecosystem. Sounds would change. The quality of light filtering through the canopy would shift. While her colleagues focused on establishing their presence, Sarah spent her first day simply sitting at the edge of camp, watching and listening. Her instruments remained passive, set only to record rather than probe or interfere. She watched the way shadows moved, noting patterns that suggested the trees were communicating through controlled light manipulation. She listened to sounds that formed complex rhythms, as if the entire forest was engaged in an ongoing conversation. By the third day, the ecosystem's response to the human presence had become undeniable. Equipment began to malfunction in ways that seemed almost intelligent. Sensors would provide false readings that led teams away from areas of particular interest. Food supplies developed contamination that appeared overnight, despite secure storage protocols. Most disturbing, several team members reported feeling watched whenever they moved beyond the immediate camp. Perimeter Dr. Webb's response was to increase security measures and request permission to use more aggressive sampling techniques. "We're dealing with a coordinated defense response," he announced during the evening briefing. "The ecosystem has some kind of distributed intelligence network that's actively working against our research efforts. We need to establish dominance before it can organize a more serious attack." Sarah disagreed completely. What you're calling a defense response might actually be an attempt at communication. Look at the patterns. She displayed her collected data on the main screen. The equipment malfunctions aren't random. They're following a sequence that mirrors the light patterns we've observed in the tree structures. The contamination in our food supplies contains biochemical markers that match substances we've detected in the air. This isn't an attack, it's an attempt to establish some kind of dialogue. Commander Rodriguez looked skeptical. Dialogue with what exactly? We haven't detected any signs of civilization or organized intelligence. Sarah gestured toward the towering structures around them. Commander, what if the intelligence isn't located in individuals the way we understand them? What if the entire ecosystem functions as a single cognitive system? The trees, the ground organisms, even the atmospheric chemistry could all be components of a distributed mind, trying to figure out what we are and how we fit into its world. That night, Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her colleagues if they had known about it. Instead of sleeping in her assigned shelter within the secure perimeter, she took her sleeping bag and moved to a position just outside the camp's defensive barriers. She disabled her personal beacon and settled down among what appeared to be a grove of the metallic trees. The response was immediate and overwhelming. As darkness fell, the forest around her came alive with activity that had been invisible during daylight hours. Creatures emerged from hidden spaces in the ground and trees, organisms unlike anything in Earth's evolutionary history. Some looked like moving plants with crystalline cores that pulsed with their own light. Others appeared to be living geometric shapes that flowed through the air like three-dimensional music made visible. Sarah's first instinct was the same terror that would have gripped any human finding themselves surrounded by unknown predators in the dark. But she forced herself to remain still, to breathe slowly, to project calm rather than fear. She had learned years ago that panic was the one emotion guaranteed to trigger aggressive responses from wild creatures. The organisms approached her sleeping area with obvious caution. Sarah could sense their confusion. She was clearly a foreign element, something that didn't belong in their carefully balanced world. But she wasn't behaving like the other humans they had encountered. She wasn't trying to cut pieces from their environment or establish dominance through technology. She was simply present, waiting, listening. The first contact came from what looked like a cross between a butterfly and a geometric crystal, a creature that seemed to exist as much in mathematics as in biology. It landed on her outstretched hand with a touch so light she almost missed it. The moment of contact sent information flooding through her nervous system. Not words or images, but direct understanding of patterns and relationships that governed life in this place. Sarah realized she was experiencing something that xenobiologists had theorized about, but never encountered. Direct biochemical communication with an alien intelligence. The creature wasn't just touching her. It was sharing sensory data and emotional states through chemical exchanges happening at the molecular level. She could sense its curiosity, its attempt to categorize her within the frameworks it used to understand living things. More creatures approached as the night progressed. Each contact added new layers to the communication, building a complex picture of how this world understood itself. Sarah began to grasp that the entire planet operated as a kind of living laboratory, where different life forms existed not in competition, but in collaboration, each contributing to a larger experiment in consciousness and evolution. When dawn broke, Sarah found herself at the center of a circle of sleeping creatures. Predators that should have seen her as prey had chosen instead to rest beside her, their natural aggression somehow transformed into protective instinct. She understood now why the previous expeditions had failed. They had approached this world as territory to be conquered, rather than as a community to be joined. The sight that greeted her teammates when they discovered her location would become legendary in xenobiological circles. Dr. Sarah Chen, whose medical records showed her as barely fit for Earth-normal environments, was lying peacefully among creatures that could have dissolved her bones with their breath, or paralyzed her nervous system with a touch. But instead of attacking, the predators of this death world had chosen to guard her sleep. Commander Rodriguez's voice shook as he called out to her. "Jen, don't move. We're going to try to extract you safely." Sarah smiled and gently shifted position, causing several of the sleeping creatures to adjust their positions to maintain contact with her. "Commander, I don't think extraction is going to be necessary. I think we've been approaching this all wrong. These aren't predators trying to eliminate us. They're gardeners trying to figure out how to help us grow." The extraction of Sarah from her position among the alien creatures required 3 hours of careful negotiation, not with her, but with the organisms that had chosen to protect her. Commander Rodriguez had positioned his soldiers in a wide perimeter, weapons ready but not targeted, while Dr. Webb operated remote scanning equipment to analyze the situation from a safe distance. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about predator behavior. The creatures surrounding Sarah were apex predators by every biological measure. Their acidic secretions could dissolve titanium alloy. Their neural projection capabilities could overwhelm human brain function from 50 meters away. Their physical strength exceeded that of Earth's most dangerous animals. Yet they showed no aggression toward the frail human woman sleeping among them. Sarah's awakening process became a masterclass in interspecies communication. As she slowly sat up, she maintained physical contact with several creatures, her hands resting on what appeared to be the lead organism, a magnificent being that looked like a fusion of plant, animal, and living crystal. The creature's internal light patterns shifted in response to her touch, and she found herself understanding its communication on an instinctive level. "They want to know why the other humans are afraid," Sarah called out to her colleagues. "They've been trying to establish contact since we arrived, but our defensive responses have been interpreted as rejection of their attempts at welcome." Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the communication system. "Chen, those things you're touching are the same species that dissolved the previous expedition's equipment. They're not trying to welcome us. They're studying us before they eliminate us." Sarah felt a wave of what could only be described as amusement flow through the biochemical connection she had established with the creatures. "Marcus, they find that interpretation fascinating. They want me to explain why humans always assume the worst possible motivations for actions they don't understand." The process of Sarah's integration back into the human camp took most of the morning, but not because the creatures were reluctant to let her go. Instead, they seemed genuinely interested in facilitating better communication between the two species. Several of the smaller organisms followed her back to the perimeter, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly observing the human settlement with intense curiosity. Commander Rodriguez called an emergency meeting as soon as Sarah was safely within the camp's barriers. "Chen, I need to understand what happened out there. My instruments recorded biochemical changes in your system that should have been lethal. Your cellular activity spiked to levels that would indicate massive poisoning, but you show no symptoms of distress." Sarah was still processing the information she had received during her night among the creatures. "Commander, I don't think they were trying to poison me. I think they were trying to upgrade me. This world operates on principles of symbiotic evolution that we've never encountered before. The creatures here don't just adapt to their environment. They actively modify other organisms to create better integration with the ecosystem." She showed them the data her personal monitors had collected during the night. Her bone density had increased by 12%. Her muscle efficiency showed improvements that would normally take months of intensive training. Her neural activity patterns had developed new pathways that seemed designed to process the biochemical communication methods used by the native organisms. Dr. Webb was horrified. "You're describing aggressive biological modification without consent. Those creatures were performing unauthorized genetic alterations on a human subject. This is exactly the kind of threat the safety protocols were designed to prevent." But Sarah felt something different. For the first time in her adult life, her body felt strong. The chronic fatigue that had plagued her since childhood was gone. The brittle bones that had limited her mobility had become resilient. The weak muscles that had made physical labor difficult now carried her with an efficiency that amazed her. "Marcus, what if you're wrong about the threat assessment? What if these organisms aren't trying to eliminate us, but to help us survive in their world? Every previous expedition failed because they fought against the environment. What if the key to success is allowing the environment to help us adapt?" Over the following days, Sarah began spending increasing amounts of time beyond the camp's perimeter, always with the consent of Commander Rodriguez but against the strong objections of Dr. Webb. Each excursion brought new revelations about the nature of Kepler 442b's ecosystem. The world operated as a vast, biological network where every organism contributed to collective intelligence and mutual survival. The trees weren't just plants, but information processors that maintained the chemical balance of the atmosphere. The ground-dwelling creatures weren't just animals, but living sensors that monitored the health of soil and water systems. Even the atmospheric bacteria served as communication relays, carrying chemical messages across vast distances. Sarah's role in this system was evolving daily. The organisms had initially categorized her as a damaged version of their standard biological templates. Her weak bones, inefficient muscles, and limited sensory capabilities had triggered their instinct to provide corrective modifications. But as she learned to communicate more effectively, they began to understand that she represented something entirely new. A conscious being from outside their world who wanted to understand rather than dominate their system. The breakthrough came during her 5th night sleeping among the creatures. Sarah awoke to find herself at the center of what could only be described as a biological conference. Representatives of every major species group in the local ecosystem had gathered around her sleeping area. The largest creature, something that resembled a living mountain of crystalline coral, was engaged in complex chemical communication with dozens of smaller organisms. Through her growing ability to interpret their biochemical language, Sarah understood that they were debating her status within their world. Some viewed her as a curiosity to be studied and eventually released. Others saw her as a potential new member of their ecological community. A few seemed to consider her a bridge between their world and the other humans who remained isolated within their defensive perimeter. The decision they reached would change everything. Rather than continuing to view the human expedition as foreign invaders to be eliminated or expelled, they chose to treat Sarah as an ambassador. If she could learn to fully integrate with their biological network, she could serve as a translator between their distributed intelligence and the individual consciousness patterns that humans used. The implications were staggering. Sarah realized she was being offered the chance to become the first human to truly join an alien ecosystem, not as a conqueror or even as a guest, but as a participating member of a planetary consciousness that spanned multiple species and billions of years of evolutionary development. When she returned to camp the next morning, Sarah carried with her an offer that would force humanity to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their place in the universe. The creatures of Kepler 442b were willing to share their world and their knowledge, but only with humans who were prepared to become something more than they had been before. The question now was whether her colleagues would have the courage to accept the transformation that would make true cooperation possible, or whether they would choose the safety of separation and miss the opportunity to join something magnificent and terrifying, a living world that wanted to welcome them home. Dr. Webb's reaction to Sarah's proposal was immediate and violent. Absolutely not. What you're describing isn't scientific cooperation, it's biological contamination. Those creatures have altered your brain chemistry to make you compliant with their agenda. You're talking like someone who's been compromised by alien influence. Sarah felt the truth of his accusations in her modified neural pathways, but she also understood something he couldn't grasp. The changes weren't making her compliant, they were making her capable. For the first time in her life, she could perceive the complex biological relationships that governed life on multiple levels simultaneously. She could sense the emotional states of her colleagues through subtle chemical signatures in their breath. She could feel the stress patterns of the entire ecosystem responding to their presence. Commander Rodriguez found himself caught between military protocols that demanded caution and scientific opportunities that might never come again. Chen, I need you to submit to a full medical evaluation. If those organisms have compromised your judgment, we need to know before we make any decisions based on your recommendations. The medical examination revealed changes that fascinated and terrified the expedition's medical officer. Sarah's DNA showed integration patterns that suggested her cellular structure was being systematically optimized for survival in Kepler 442b's environment. Her immune system had developed responses to toxins that didn't exist on Earth. Her nervous system showed new pathways that seemed designed for processing types of sensory input that human brains weren't naturally equipped to handle. The modifications are stable and beneficial, Dr. Martinez reported to the command team. Her bone density is now higher than any human on record. Her muscle efficiency exceeds that of Olympic athletes. Her reaction time and sensory processing capabilities are operating at levels that would be impossible without technological enhancement. But the question we have to ask is whether these improvements come with hidden costs we don't understand. While the command team debated Sarah's condition, the ecosystem around the camp had begun showing signs of change that couldn't be ignored. Equipment that had been malfunctioning was suddenly working perfectly. Food supplies that had shown signs of contamination were now testing as nutritionally enhanced versions of their original forms. Most remarkably, the defensive barriers that had been established around the camp were being systematically integrated into the local environment in ways that made them more effective while reducing their impact on native species. The creatures weren't trying to eliminate the human presence, they were trying to improve it. But their methods of improvement required acceptance of changes that challenged fundamental human assumptions about identity and independence. Sarah found herself spending entire days serving as translator between her colleagues and the planetary intelligence that surrounded them. The conversations were unlike anything in human experience. The ecosystem didn't think in terms of individual organisms pursuing separate goals. It thought in terms of optimization across vast networks of interconnected lives, each contributing to patterns that spanned centuries. "They're offering us something incredible," Sarah explained during another emergency briefing. "They want to share their knowledge of biological engineering, their methods of environmental harmony, their techniques for extending consciousness across multiple species. But they can only share these gifts with beings who are compatible with their biological network." Dr. Webb had reached his breaking point. "What you're calling gifts, I call parasitic infection. Those creatures are systematically replacing human biology with alien modifications. You're not Sarah Chen anymore. You're something they've built using her body as raw material." The accusation hit harder than Sarah expected because it contained enough truth to be painful. She was changing in ways that went beyond the physical modifications. Her priorities had shifted. Her loyalties were becoming divided between her human colleagues and the ecosystem that was welcoming her into its embrace. She found herself thinking in timescales that spanned generations rather than years, but she also understood something her colleagues couldn't see. The changes weren't destroying her humanity, they were expanding it. She was becoming something larger than she had been before, while still retaining everything that made her uniquely herself. The crisis came when Commander Rodriguez received orders from the orbital station to prepare for immediate evacuation. The expedition's findings had been transmitted to Earth, and the response from the colonial authority was unambiguous. Any technology that could modify human biology without consent was too dangerous to study. The expedition was to collect all possible data and return to safe distance for further analysis. Sarah realized she faced an impossible choice. She could return to human space and lose forever the connection she had built with Kepler 442b's living network. Or she could stay and become something that her own species might not recognize as human. The decision was made for her by the ecosystem itself. As the evacuation preparations began, the creatures that had been working to integrate the human camp into the local environment suddenly withdrew their cooperation. Equipment began failing again. Food supplies developed contamination that made them inedible. The environmental modifications that had made the camp comfortable were systematically reversed. But the changes didn't affect Sarah. Her personal equipment continued functioning perfectly. The food she ate remained nutritious and safe. The organisms that had adopted her maintained their protective behavior, creating a bubble of cooperation around her even as they demonstrated their ability to make life impossible for her colleagues. "They're making a point," Sarah realized. "They're showing us that cooperation has to be chosen, not forced. They can make our presence here impossible, or they can make it the most successful human expedition in history, but they can't do both at the same time." Commander Rodriguez faced a command decision that would determine the future of human-alien relations. He could follow orders and evacuate his team, losing the opportunity for unprecedented cooperation with an alien intelligence. Or he could trust the judgment of a team member whose biology had been altered by that same intelligence. "Chen, I need you to give me an honest assessment. Are you still human enough to represent human interests in whatever agreement you're negotiating with these creatures?" Sarah considered the question with care that reflected both her enhanced analytical capabilities and her unchanged commitment to scientific truth. "Commander, I'm more human than I've ever been before. These modifications haven't changed who I am. They've made it possible for me to become who I was always meant to be, but I understand why that might not be a reassuring answer." The standoff continued for 3 days, with the ecosystem demonstrating its ability to support or sabotage the human presence, based on their willingness to accept deeper integration. Sarah found herself caught between two forms of life that viewed reality in fundamentally different ways, each convinced that their approach offered the best hope for survival and growth. The resolution would require unprecedented courage from both sides, and a willingness to risk everything for the possibility of something that had never existed before. A true partnership between human ambition and alien wisdom, mediated by someone who had become a bridge between worlds that might otherwise never learn to trust each other. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, the expedition's medical officer, had been quietly analyzing the biological modifications occurring in Sarah's system, with growing fascination rather than fear. While Dr. Webb saw contamination and Commander Rodriguez saw security risks, Martinez saw medical miracles that could revolutionize human health and longevity. "Commander, I've been reviewing the data from Chen's modifications for the past week," Martinez announced during the morning briefing. "What these organisms have accomplished goes beyond anything in our medical technology. They've essentially cured genetic conditions that we considered permanent features of human biology. Her respiratory efficiency is now optimized for this planet's atmosphere. But it would also make her superhuman in any Earth environment." Sarah watched her colleagues' faces as Martinez presented his findings. The modifications weren't just adaptations for survival on Kepler 442b. They were improvements that would benefit any human in any environment. Enhanced immune system responses that could eliminate most known diseases. Skeletal density improvements that would prevent age-related bone loss. Neural pathway enhancements that increased processing speed and memory formation. "The question we should be asking isn't whether these changes are dangerous," Martinez continued. "The question is whether we can afford to refuse them. Chen has become a preview of what human beings could become if we're willing to work with these organisms instead of against them." Dr. Webb's opposition remained fierce. "Martinez, you're talking about fundamental alterations to human nature. Even if these modifications are beneficial, do we have the right to make decisions that will affect our entire species? What happens to humanity if we allow alien organisms to redesign our biology according to their preferences?" Sarah felt the ecosystem's response to Webb's objections through her enhanced sensory connections. The planetary intelligence found his concerns both understandable and puzzling. From their perspective, refusing beneficial modifications was like choosing to remain sick when healing was available. They couldn't comprehend why any intelligent species would maintain biological limitations when improvements were possible. "Marcus, I think you're misunderstanding their motivations," Sarah said. "They're not trying to redesign humanity according to their preferences. They're trying to help us achieve our own potential. The modifications they've made aren't changing who I am. They're removing barriers that prevented me from becoming who I could be." Commander Rodriguez had been listening to the debates with growing frustration. His orders were clear: evacuate the team and return to safe distance for further analysis. But his responsibility to the mission's scientific objectives was equally clear: gather information that could benefit human knowledge and capabilities. "I'm going to make a decision that's probably going to end my military career," he announced. "We're going to extend our mission timeline to allow for voluntary participation in the modification process. Anyone who wants to return to the orbital station can do so immediately. Anyone who wants to explore cooperation with the ecosystem can remain under my command." The response split the team exactly as expected. Dr. Webb immediately requested evacuation, along with 3 of the security personnel who expressed concerns about alien biological influence. Dr. Martinez volunteered to undergo the modification process, as did 2 of the younger researchers who saw the opportunity as unprecedented in human history. The evacuation shuttle launched that afternoon, carrying the team members who chose safety over exploration. Sarah watched it disappear into the cloud cover with mixed emotions. She understood their choice, but she also knew they were missing the chance to participate in something that would transform human understanding of life itself. The modification process for the volunteers proved to be nothing like the traumatic biological invasion that Dr. Webb had predicted. Instead of forced changes imposed by alien organisms, it was a collaborative process that required active participation and conscious choice at every stage. Dr. Martinez was the first to undergo the full integration procedure. Sarah served as translator and guide, helping him understand the biochemical communications he received as the organisms began optimizing his biological systems. The process took 3 days, during which Martinez experienced improvements similar to Sarah's but customized for his specific genetic profile and medical history. The most remarkable change was in his understanding of biological systems. Martinez had been a competent medical officer before the modifications, but afterward, he could perceive cellular processes with an intuitive clarity that made him effectively superhuman in his diagnostic abilities. He could sense the health status of other team members through subtle environmental cues, predict illness before symptoms appeared, and understand the biological basis of emotional states with unprecedented precision. "It's not that they're giving us alien abilities," Martinez explained to the remaining team. "They're unlocking human potentials that our evolutionary history never required us to develop. We have the genetic capacity for these improvements. We just never faced environmental pressures that would activate them naturally." The two younger researchers, Dr. Kim and Dr. Patel, underwent their modifications over the following week. Each process was unique, tailored to their individual biological signatures and professional specializations. Kim's enhanced pattern recognition abilities made her phenomenally effective at understanding ecosystem relationships. Patel's improved neural processing allowed him to simultaneously track dozens of environmental variables in real time. But the most significant changes were in their ability to communicate with each other and with the ecosystem. They developed a form of biochemical communication that supplemented their spoken language, allowing them to share complex ideas and emotional states with unprecedented clarity. They could sense each other's health and well-being from across the camp. They could feel the mood of the entire ecosystem and respond to environmental changes before their instruments detected them. Commander Rodriguez held out the longest, torn between his duty to protect his team and his growing understanding of what they were becoming. Sarah could sense his internal struggle through her enhanced empathic abilities. He was witnessing his personnel transform into something beyond normal human capabilities, and he wasn't sure whether he was observing evolution or contamination. The decision was ultimately made for him by circumstances beyond his control. During a routine survey mission, Rodriguez fell into a concealed pit filled with organisms that would have been lethal to an unmodified human. The acidic environment should have killed him within minutes, but instead, he found himself surrounded by creatures that seemed intent on preventing his death rather than causing it. Sarah and Martinez reached him within an hour, finding him unconscious but alive at the bottom of the pit. The organisms had formed a protective barrier around him, neutralizing the acidic environment and providing breathable atmosphere while his body underwent emergency modifications needed for survival. When Rodriguez regained consciousness, he discovered that the choice to undergo modifications had been made for him by the ecosystem's determination to preserve his life. But unlike the gradual voluntary process experienced by his team members, his changes had been implemented as emergency medical intervention. The results exceeded anything they had seen before. Rodriguez's military training combined with the ecosystem's biological enhancements made him physically capable of feats that bordered on superhuman. His reaction time, strength, and endurance reached levels that would have been impossible without the modifications. But more importantly, his strategic thinking abilities were enhanced by access to the ecosystem's collective intelligence network. Rodriguez could now perceive threats and opportunities across vast areas simultaneously, processing information from thousands of biological sensors throughout the forest. His military experience provided the framework for interpreting this data, while the biological enhancements gave him the processing power to act on insights that would have overwhelmed a normal human mind. "I understand now why they were so insistent about integration," Rodriguez told his team during their evening briefing. "They weren't trying to control us or change our essential nature. They were trying to give us the tools we'd need to survive and thrive in a universe that's far more complex and dangerous than we realized." The transformation of the entire remaining team marked the beginning of a new phase in the mission. They were no longer human visitors studying an alien ecosystem. They were integrated members of a planetary intelligence that spanned multiple species and billions of years of evolutionary development. But their human perspectives and capabilities brought something entirely new to the collective: consciousness. The ecosystem had evolved as a perfect system for maintaining biological harmony and environmental stability, but it had never encountered the kind of creative problem-solving and technological innovation that humans brought to challenges. The combination of human ingenuity with alien biological mastery began producing solutions that neither species could have achieved alone. Sarah found herself at the center of developments that would reshape human understanding of consciousness, identity, and possibility. The modifications had not diminished her humanity. They had amplified it. She remained recognizably herself, but with capabilities that allowed her to participate in forms of existence that transcended individual biological boundaries. The most profound change was in her relationship with the concept of death. The ecosystem's distributed consciousness meant that individual organisms could die without losing their accumulated knowledge and experience. Through the biological network, consciousness could be preserved and shared across multiple bodies, allowing for a form of immortality that didn't depend on preventing physical death. Sarah realized that the ecosystem was offering humanity something that no technology could provide: the chance to transcend the limitations of individual existence while retaining everything that made them uniquely human. But accepting this gift required abandoning the isolation and independence that had defined human consciousness throughout their evolutionary history. The team began transmitting their findings back to the orbital station, but their reports painted a picture that human authorities found difficult to accept. They described biological modifications that enhanced rather than diminished human capabilities. They reported integration with alien intelligence that expanded rather than replaced human consciousness. They documented opportunities for cooperation that could benefit both species while preserving the essential characteristics of each. But from the perspective of human space, these reports sounded like the communications of people who had been fundamentally compromised by alien influence. The colonial authorities' response was predictable: immediate quarantine of Kepler 442b and classification of the modified humans as potential biological hazards. Sarah watched the orbital station's defensive systems activate, knowing that her own species now viewed her as a threat rather than a pioneer. The ecosystem around her responded to this development with patient concern rather than aggression. They had hoped that humanity would choose cooperation over conflict, but they were prepared to wait as long as necessary for fear to give way to understanding. The modified team faced a choice that would define the future of human-alien relations. They could attempt to convince their species that integration was beneficial, risking rejection and isolation, or they could focus on building something new on Kepler 442b, creating a community that might someday serve as a bridge between two forms of consciousness that had found a way to enhance each other rather than compete for dominance. 2 years after the first contact, Sarah Chen stood at the edge of what had once been the human expedition camp, now transformed into something that defied easy categorization. The defensive barriers had evolved into living structures that provided shelter while contributing to the ecosystem's atmospheric processing. The research equipment had been integrated into biological networks that expanded their capabilities beyond anything possible with purely technological approaches. The quarantine imposed by human space had become irrelevant. The modified team had built something that transcended the need for external approval or support. They had become the first human community to achieve true sustainability on an alien world, not through domination or isolation, but through integration that preserved their humanity while expanding their capabilities. Sarah's own transformation had continued far beyond the initial modifications. She could now communicate directly with the planetary intelligence through biochemical interfaces that allowed her to participate in decision-making processes that spanned continents. But she had also retained her human curiosity, her scientific methodology, and her commitment to understanding rather than simply accepting. The community they had built included not just the original expedition members, but volunteers who had arrived despite the official quarantine. Word of their success had spread through unofficial channels, attracting scientists, philosophers, and explorers who were willing to risk everything for the chance to participate in humanity's next evolutionary step. Dr. Martinez had become something like a doctor to both humans and alien organisms, his enhanced diagnostic abilities allowing him to treat biological conditions across multiple species. Dr. Kim had developed new forms of agriculture that produced food optimized for modified human physiology while contributing to the ecosystem's nutrient cycles. Dr. Patel had created communication systems that allowed real-time coordination between human consciousness and the distributed intelligence of the planet. Commander Rodriguez had established security protocols that protected the community without isolating it from the wider ecosystem. His military experience, enhanced by biological modifications, had made him uniquely effective at mediating between human and alien approaches to conflict resolution. But the most significant development was the arrival of children. The first generation of humans born on Kepler 442b were developing capabilities that exceeded even those of the modified adults. They could communicate with alien organisms from birth, participate in ecosystem-level decision-making before they could walk, and demonstrate forms of consciousness that integrated individual and collective awareness in ways that amazed their parents. These children represented something entirely new in human evolution. People who had never known the limitations of unmodified biology, who had grown up as full participants in an alien ecosystem, but who remained recognizably and completely human in their curiosity, creativity, and individual personality development. Sarah often found herself serving as ambassador between the community and the occasional representatives from human space who managed to evade the quarantine restrictions. These visitors invariably arrived expecting to find humans who had been corrupted or controlled by alien influences. Instead, they discovered people who had become more capable, more healthy, and more fulfilled than any humans in recorded history. The conversations were always difficult. How do you explain to someone that you've become more human than you used to be? How do you describe enhancements that expand consciousness without diminishing individual identity? How do you convince people that cooperation with alien intelligence doesn't require surrendering human values? Sarah's response had evolved over time. She would take visitors to observe the community's daily life, letting them see for themselves the reality of human-alien integration, children playing games that spanned multiple species, adults working on projects that combined human creativity with alien biological mastery, families living in homes that were themselves alive and responsive to their inhabitants' needs. The question isn't whether we're still human, Sarah would explain to skeptical visitors. The question is whether we're finally becoming everything that humans were always capable of being. We haven't lost our humanity. We've discovered that humanity was always meant to be bigger than we imagined. Some visitors chose to stay and undergo the modification process themselves. Others returned to human space with reports that were dismissed as alien propaganda or evidence of biological contamination. But gradually, word spread that there was a place where humans could become something more than they had been, without losing anything essential to their nature. The ecosystem's patience had been rewarded. They had waited for humanity to overcome their fear of change, their attachment to biological limitations, their assumption that cooperation required surrender of independence. In Sarah and her community, they had found partners who brought human innovation and creativity to problems that had puzzled the planetary intelligence for millennia. The partnership was producing results that amazed both species. Human engineering concepts enhanced with alien biological mastery were creating technologies that seemed like magic. Alien wisdom about ecological harmony combined with human ambition was opening possibilities for expansion into environments that neither species could have colonized alone. Plans were already developing for similar communities on other worlds. The techniques for human ecosystem integration could be adapted to different planetary conditions, allowing humanity to spread throughout the galaxy not as conquerors, but as partners with the living systems they encountered. Sarah Chen, who had once been considered too weak and fragile for the challenges of space exploration, had become the architect of humanity's transformation, from isolated biological entities to participants in a galactic community of consciousness that spanned species and worlds. Her body, enhanced by alien modifications, now possessed strength and resilience that exceeded any human in history. Her mind, expanded by integration with planetary intelligence, could perceive and understand patterns that crossed the boundaries between biology, physics, and consciousness. Her spirit, nurtured by acceptance and cooperation rather than conflict and competition, had found a peace and purpose that filled every moment with wonder. But most importantly, she remained recognizably and completely Sarah Chen, curious, determined, compassionate, and committed to building bridges between different forms of life. She had not been diminished by her transformation. She had been fulfilled by it. The predators of the Deathworld that had once threatened to eliminate human presence now served as guardians of a community where humans and aliens had learned to dream together. And at the center of it all was a woman who had been considered weak on paper, but whose strength had made possible the greatest partnership in human history. The quarantine would eventually be lifted. Humanity would eventually accept that evolution could be chosen rather than endured, and Sarah Chen would be remembered not as the fragile scientist who survived an alien world, but as the pioneer who taught two species how to become more than either could be alone.